The first thing my wife heard after the crash was not the siren. It was my thought. If she dies, I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself. Her eyes opened beneath the harsh white hospital lights. She stared at me. Then she whispered, "You think it's your fault?" I froze. I hadn't said a word. My wife, Clara, had been unconscious for 11 hours after the accident. The doctors told me she had suffered a concussion, several broken ribs, and a minor brain injury. They said confusion was normal. But Clara looked at me as if she had just discovered something terrifying. "What did you say?" I asked. "I didn't hear you say anything." Her voice trembled. "I heard what you were thinking." I laughed nervously because I didn't know what else to do. "Clara, you're probably disoriented." She closed her eyes. Then she suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Daniel." "What?" "You were thinking about the night at the restaurant." My smile disappeared. 3 weeks earlier, I had seen Clara sitting across from Marcus, the senior partner at her law firm. They had looked too comfortable together. When I asked her about it, she told me they were discussing a case. I believed her, because I had spent 12 years believing Clara. We met when we were 24. She was stubborn, brilliant, and terrible at admitting when she needed help. I was quieter. I remembered little things. Her favorite tea, the song she played when she was stressed, the fact that she hated thunderstorms but pretended she didn't. When she became a lawyer, I worked extra hours at the engineering firm where I was employed so she could take a year off to study for her bar exams. When she passed, she cried in my arms. "You believed in me when nobody else did," she told me. "I'll always believe in you." I meant it. Maybe that was my mistake. Because now, lying beside her hospital bed, I was terrified by what she could hear. Clara looked at me again. "You thought Marcus was lying to me." I swallowed. "I did." She turned pale. "Why?" "Because I saw you with him." "That isn't what I asked." Her eyes filled with tears. "You thought I was cheating." I couldn't answer. She already knew. That was when the accident truly began to feel like something more than broken glass and twisted metal. It was as if every wall between us had suddenly disappeared, and Clara could hear everything I'd spent years keeping inside, including the truth I had never dared to say. "I'm tired." Her face crumpled. "You're tired of me?" "No." But she flinched, because she heard the thought behind my answer. "I'm tired of being the only one trying." For the first time in 12 years, my wife looked at me without the protection of my polite words, and I realized something even more frightening. She could hear me, but I could finally see her. The doctors called it a temporary neurological phenomenon. They said Clara's injury might have disrupted the way her brain processed sound, memory, and internal speech. But there was one detail they couldn't explain. She wasn't hearing random thoughts. She was hearing thoughts connected to people emotionally close to her. The closer the relationship, the clearer the thoughts became. For the first 2 days, she was overwhelmed. A nurse walked in, and Clara suddenly covered her ears. "Please leave." The nurse looked confused. Clara whispered, "She thinks I smell terrible." The nurse's face turned red. I almost laughed. Almost. Then Clara looked at me. "What are you thinking now?" "Nothing." She gave me a tired smile. "You've always been a terrible liar." That sentence used to make me smile. Now it hurt. I stayed beside her anyway. I brought her soup. I helped her walk. I called her mother. I answered every message from her law firm. I didn't mention Marcus. I didn't accuse her. I didn't ask what she had been hiding. I simply watched. And Clara began hearing things she could never unhear. On the third evening, she asked, "Why didn't you tell me you rejected the promotion?" I stared at her. "What? You thought about it yesterday." I looked away. 2 months earlier, my company had offered me a senior position in another city. It would have doubled my salary, but Clara had just been assigned a major case. So I declined. I never told her. She had never asked. I thought sacrificing quietly was what love meant. Clara's expression changed. "You gave that up for me." "I didn't think it mattered." "It mattered to you." I shrugged. "It doesn't anymore." She stared at me for a long time. Then she asked the question I had been avoiding. "Daniel, what else have you never told me?" I wanted to say nothing. Instead, I said a lot. Her eyes lowered. That night, while she slept, I sat beside the window and remembered the beginning of our marriage. Our first apartment had peeling paint and a kitchen so small that only one person could stand it at a time. We had eaten instant noodles on our wedding anniversary because we couldn't afford a restaurant. Clara had laughed until she cried. "Promise me something," she had said. "What?" "If we ever become successful, don't let money change us." I had promised. But somewhere along the way, success had changed Clara, or maybe I had simply refused to notice. The next morning, Marcus arrived. He stood in the doorway holding flowers. Clara looked at him. Then her face went completely still. I couldn't hear his thoughts. She could. And whatever she heard made her hands begin to shake. "Clara," he said gently, "we need to talk." She looked at me. For the first time since the crash, she seemed afraid of what she was about to discover. "Daniel," she whispered, "please don't leave." I stood there silently, because something inside me had already begun to understand. The accident hadn't just changed what Clara could hear. It had changed what I was willing to tolerate. And Marcus had come to the hospital carrying a secret that could destroy the marriage we had spent 12 years building. Marcus closed the hospital door behind him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Clara looked directly at him. "What are you hiding?" Marcus frowned. "I'm not hiding anything." Clara's fingers tightened around the blanket. I watched her face change. She was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Finally," she said, "you told me the documents were destroyed." Marcus went completely still. I looked at him. "What documents?" He didn't answer. Clara's breathing quickened. "Marcus!" He stepped toward her. "You're confused because of the accident." She shook her head. "No, I'm hearing you clearly." That sentence seemed to frighten him more than the accusation itself. I stood up. "I'm going downstairs." Clara grabbed my sleeve. "Don't." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because I don't want you to leave before I know the truth." I sat back down. Marcus looked between us. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and walked into the hallway. Clara closed her eyes. "He's thinking about the contract." "What contract?" "The one involving your company." My stomach tightened. My company? Marcus had been representing a technology firm that had recently become one of our biggest clients. I designed a structural monitoring system for them, but the project had been canceled 6 months earlier. At least, that's what I had been told. I looked at Clara. "What does he think about it?" She hesitated. "He thinks you never knew what happened to your design." I felt something cold move through me. My design. 3 years earlier, I had spent 18 months developing a predictive system that could detect microscopic structural failures in bridges and industrial buildings before they became dangerous. My company had shelved the project. My supervisor told me the market wasn't ready. I believed him, or maybe I wanted to, because by then, Clara was working 80-hour weeks, and I had convinced myself that my own ambitions could wait. Marcus returned. "Everything is fine," he said. Clara stared at him. "No, it isn't." He looked at me. "Daniel, you should go home." I laughed once. "Why?" "Because Clara needs rest. She needs the truth." His jaw tightened. That was the moment I understood. There was something between them. Not necessarily an affair. Something worse. A decision. A decision that had been made without me. Clara suddenly covered her ears. "Stop." Marcus stepped backward. "What?" "Stop thinking about it." He looked terrified. I turned to Clara. "What is he thinking?" She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "He's thinking that if you find out where your invention went, everything will collapse." My heart began pounding. I had spent years believing I was ordinary. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe the part of my life I had sacrificed had been taken from me. And maybe my wife knew. That night, Clara finally told me the first piece of the truth. The technology company had purchased the rights to my design through a shell corporation. My own company had quietly transferred the rights, and Clara had helped negotiate the legal paperwork. I stared at her. "You knew," she cried. "I knew something was wrong." "That's not what I asked." She looked down. "Yes." The word broke something inside me. Not because of the invention, because for years, I had thought Clara was the one person who would never stand on the other side of secret. I remembered our tiny apartment, our cheap wedding rings, her sleeping against my shoulder before her first major trial. All those memories suddenly felt like evidence in a case against me. "What else?" I asked. Clara couldn't meet my eyes. "There is more." I thought I was prepared for the next confession. I wasn't. Clara told me Marcus had convinced her that selling the rights would protect me. He had said my company was going to eliminate my position after the project failed. He had said the technology would disappear unless someone moved quickly. And he had promised that the buyer would give me a consulting position later. None of that happened. Instead, the company that acquired my design turned it into a multi-million-dollar product. The product was now being installed in bridges across the country. I had never received a cent. I had never even been told the product existed. I stared at Clara. Why didn't you tell me? She started crying. Because I thought I was protecting you. By letting someone steal my work? I didn't know they would use it without you. You signed the agreement. I thought I was buying you time. I stood up. She reached for my hand. I pulled it away. That small movement hurt her more than shouting would have. But I had no anger left. Only exhaustion. You didn't protect me, I said quietly. You made a decision about my life because you thought you knew what was best for me. She whispered, I'm sorry. I believed her. That was the worst part. I believed she was sorry. But regret didn't undo betrayal. The next day, Clara's mother arrived. She hugged her daughter and then looked at me. You need to be patient with her. I nodded. I have been patient for 12 years. She didn't know what to say. Then Marcus called. He wanted to meet me privately. I almost refused. Instead, I went. We sat in a quiet cafe near the hospital. Marcus placed a folder on the table. You were always talented, he said. I know. He looked surprised. Perhaps nobody had ever heard me say it. You don't understand what happened. Then explain. He leaned forward. Clara was under enormous pressure. Your company was going to fire you. She thought she could save your career. She could have asked me. She was afraid you'd refuse. I looked at him. And you? He was silent. That silence answered everything. You wanted the deal. His eyes hardened. You had no idea what the technology was worth. I know what it was worth now. He pushed the folder toward me. There is a settlement offer. I didn't open it. How much? He named the number. It was large. Large enough to make most people stop asking questions. I pushed the folder back. No. Daniel, be reasonable. I am. You could walk away with enough money to never work again. I smiled faintly. I don't want money for something that was stolen from me. He frowned. Then what do you want? For the first time, I knew the answer. The truth. When I returned to the hospital, Clara was awake. She looked at me. What did Marcus offer? A settlement. Did you take it? No. Her eyes filled with tears. Why? He sat beside her. Because I finally understand something. What? I spent 12 years protecting everyone else's comfort. I looked at my wedding ring. And somewhere along the way, I stopped protecting myself. She reached for my hand. This time, I let her hold it. But I didn't hold hers back. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight Clara. I wasn't going to punish Marcus. I wasn't going to expose anyone in anger. I was simply going to find out what my own life was worth. And once I knew, I would decide whether there was still a place in it for them. Because for the first time in 12 years, I wasn't asking, how do I keep my marriage? I was asking, what kind of life do I want? 3 weeks after the crash, Clara came home. She was physically stronger, but something between us had become fragile. Her ability to hear thoughts had not disappeared. If anything, it had become sharper. She could hear fear from strangers in crowded rooms. She could hear irritation beneath polite conversations. She could hear when someone said, I'm fine, while thinking the exact opposite. And with me, there was nowhere to hide. But I wasn't hiding anymore. I stopped explaining every decision. I stopped asking her what she wanted me to do. I simply began doing what I needed to do. The first thing I did was request every document related to my old invention. Clara watched me from the kitchen. You're really going through with this? Yes. You might lose your job. I already lost the part of my life that mattered most to me. She looked down. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know. You don't sound angry. I am. She looked surprised. I just don't think anger is useful anymore. That was when I realized how different I had become. Before the crash, I would have spent nights trying to convince Clara that we could repair everything. Now I didn't know if I wanted to. My investigation took months. The technology had been renamed. My original prototypes had been dismantled. Several internal reports had disappeared. But I found one thing nobody had expected me to find. An old engineering notebook. I had written everything in it by hand. Every formula. Every test. Every failed experiment. Every correction. I remembered writing it at 2 in the morning while Clara slept beside me. Back then, she had kissed my forehead and said, "One day, people will know your name." I smiled at the memory. Then I turned the page. At the bottom of one drawing was a note I had forgotten. If the system works, it should be able to predict stress patterns before visible damage occurs. I stared at it. The system had worked, and someone had known. I began rebuilding the prototype in my spare room. For 6 weeks, I worked before sunrise and after dinner. I didn't tell Clara what I was doing. She didn't ask. Maybe she was afraid of what she would hear if she did. One evening, she stood outside the room. "Are you happy?" I looked at the circuit board in my hands. For the first time in a long time. She nodded. Then she walked away. I expected to feel guilty. I didn't. That frightened me. Because once you stop feeling guilty for choosing yourself, you realize how much of your life was built around keeping other people comfortable. The prototype failed twice. The third version overheated. The fourth produced false readings. I nearly threw everything away. Then a woman named Nora found me sitting outside a small electronic supplier at midnight. She was carrying a box of components. "You look like someone who just lost an argument with a machine," she said. I laughed. "It's winning." She sat beside me. "What are you building?" I told her. She listened without interrupting. Then she said something Clara hadn't said in years. "That sounds difficult." "It is, but possible." I looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you haven't gone home yet." That was the first time I smiled around someone new. Nora became part of the project slowly. She wasn't impressed by my history. She didn't know my marriage. She didn't care who Marcus was. She cared about the machine. And somehow, that made me feel like a person again. The breakthrough came at 2:17 in the morning. Nora and I were staring at a monitor when the system detected a stress pattern in a steel sample before the fracture became visible. I stopped breathing. "Run it again." We did. The result appeared again. Nora stared at me. "It works." I shook my head. "No." "What?" "It works better." She laughed. "You're unbelievable." I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about Marcus. I was thinking about the 24-year-old version of myself sitting in a tiny apartment, believing that one day the world might see what he had built. For the first time, I felt like I had found him again. We applied for independent certification. Then we formed a small company. I used the savings I had left. Nora invested what she could. 3 months later, we received our first serious offer from a regional infrastructure company. Then another. Then another. We weren't rich. We weren't famous. But we were building something real. Meanwhile, Clara's life was becoming increasingly complicated. Her law firm had begun asking questions about the old transaction. Marcus had become defensive, and Clara was hearing everything. One night, she came into my office. "Daniel." I looked up. "What happened?" She stood there silently. Then she said, "Marcus knew." "Knew what?" "He knew the buyer planned to use your technology without crediting you." I didn't move. "He knew from the beginning." I closed my laptop. "How sure are you?" I heard him thinking about it. I looked at her. "Clara, I need evidence, not thoughts." "I know." She placed a flash drive on my desk. "I found this in his old case files." I didn't touch it. "What is it?" "Emails." I looked at her. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because it's yours." For a moment, I remembered the woman I had married. The woman who had once believed in me. She looked exhausted. "I know I can't undo what I did," she said. "No, but I can stop making it worse." I nodded. That was the first honest thing she had done for me in years. The emails proved the transaction had been manipulated. Marcus had hidden the true value of my invention from Clara. But they also proved something else. Clara had signed documents without reading the technical clauses. She had trusted Marcus, and she had trusted herself too much. The truth wasn't clean. Nobody was innocent. But for the first time, I could see the entire picture. I gave the evidence to my attorney. Then I went back to work. I didn't announce anything. I didn't threaten Marcus. I didn't tell Clara what would happen next. I simply continued building. 6 months later, our company was invited to demonstrate the system at a national infrastructure conference. Nora stood beside me backstage. "You nervous?" "Yes." "Good." "Why?" "Because it means you care." I looked through the curtain. Hundreds of people were waiting. Then I saw someone I hadn't expected. "Clara." She was standing near the back of the hall, and beside her was Marcus. He looked at the screen showing the name of my company. For the first time, I watched confidence disappear from his face. Clara looked at me. She didn't need to hear my thoughts. She already knew what I was thinking. This is my life now. And for the first time, I wasn't wondering whether she would come back. I was wondering whether I would ever want her to. The demonstration lasted 17 minutes. 17 minutes was all it took to change my life. I showed the audience how my system could detect abnormal stress inside structural materials before conventional inspections could identify visible damage. When the final graph appeared on the screen, the room became silent. Then people started asking questions. Not about Marcus, not about my marriage, about the work. That mattered more to me than I expected. Afterward, investors approached us. A transportation company wanted a pilot program. A university offered laboratory support. A major engineering group wanted exclusive rights. Nora and I rejected the exclusive offer. We had learned enough about trusting the wrong people. Outside the hall, I saw Clara waiting. She looked different. Not physically. Something in her expression had changed. "Congratulations," she said. "Thank you." She glanced toward the conference room. "They're all talking about you." I smiled. "They're talking about the technology." "You always do that." "Do what?" "Make yourself smaller." I didn't answer. She stepped closer. "I heard what you were thinking during the presentation." I looked at her. "What?" "You were thinking about the first apartment." I smiled faintly. You remember what I said about people knowing your name?" "Yes." She looked down. "I meant it." "I know." Her eyes filled with tears. "But I was also thinking something else," I said. "What?" "That you don't get to be part of that memory just because you regret what happened." She flinched. "I understand." That was the first time Clara didn't defend herself. Behind her, Marcus approached. His confidence had disappeared. "Daniel," he said. I waited. "We need to discuss the legal situation." "No." He looked surprised. "I have attorneys handling it." "You don't understand how serious this is." "I understand exactly how serious it is." His voice hardened. "You could destroy my career." I looked at him calmly. "No, Marcus, your decisions did that." He stared at me. Then he lowered his voice. "Clara made those decisions too." I looked at my wife. She closed her eyes. He was trying to save himself by pulling her down with him. For the first time, I felt no desire to protect either of them from the consequences. I walked away. The investigation moved quickly after that. The law firm discovered that Marcus had concealed information from several clients. The company that bought my technology faced legal scrutiny. My original employer settled with me privately rather than risk a public lawsuit. I received compensation, but money wasn't the most important result. The rights to my original work were restored. The invention was mine again. I thought that would make me feel victorious. Instead, I felt strangely empty, because the person I had once dreamed of sharing that moment with was standing on the other side of the distance I no longer knew how to cross. Clara and I began living separately. She moved into a small apartment. I rented a house near our new laboratory. We didn't file for divorce immediately. Maybe we were both afraid of making the ending official. But separation gave me something I hadn't had in years. Silence. Real silence. No arguments. No pretending. No trying to guess what someone needed from me. I could wake up and choose my day. I could work until midnight. I could eat breakfast at noon. I could sit beside the window and do absolutely nothing. And slowly, I learned that freedom didn't feel exciting at first. It felt unfamiliar. A year passed. Our company grew from 4 people to 32. We developed new versions of the system and began testing them internationally. I traveled. I spoke at engineering conferences. I taught young engineers. For the first time, people introduced me by my work instead of my relationship to someone else. But success didn't erase the past. Sometimes I still woke from dreams about the crash. Sometimes I remembered Clara sitting beside me in that tiny apartment. Sometimes I wondered whether I should have noticed the distance sooner. Nora never asked me to forget. She simply stood beside me while I remembered. One evening, after a long meeting, she handed me coffee. "You're thinking too loudly." I smiled. "You can't hear thoughts." "No, but I know your face." I laughed. She sat beside me. "You don't have to decide anything tonight." About what? About us. I looked at her. She didn't look away. I know you're still healing, she said. I don't want to become another thing you feel responsible for. That sentence affected me more than any declaration could have. Because she wasn't asking me to prove anything. She wasn't asking me to choose her. She was simply giving me a choice. And I realized how different love could feel when it wasn't built on fear. Meanwhile, Clara had begun rebuilding her own life. She left Marcus's firm. She reported the misconduct. She started working for a legal organization that helped small inventors protect their intellectual property. When I heard about it, I felt something unexpected. Pride. Not romantic love. Not longing. Just pride. She was finally becoming the person she had once promised me she would be. But our paths crossed again when she asked to meet. We sat in a quiet park. She looked nervous. I know you don't owe me anything, she said. I nodded. I just wanted to tell you something. What? The thoughts I heard after the accident changed me. I waited. I spent years thinking that knowing what people thought would make life easier. She smiled sadly. It didn't. Why? Because people are more complicated than their thoughts. She looked at me. I heard your resentment. Your disappointment, your love, your fear, and I realized something. What? You never stopped loving me. I looked away. She continued, but that wasn't enough. I met her eyes. No, I thought if I could make you understand why I did everything, you'd forgive me. I do forgive you. She froze. You do? Yes. Tears filled her eyes. But forgiveness doesn't mean returning. I know. She nodded slowly. Then she asked the question we had both avoided. Are you happy? I looked across the park. Nora was waiting near the entrance. I smiled. Yes. Clara followed my gaze. For a few seconds, she simply watched. Then she smiled too. Good. She stood. Before leaving, she said, I used to think losing you would be the worst thing that could happen to me. I waited. Now I think losing you was the consequence of not understanding what I had. She walked away. I didn't follow. And that night, I realized something important. The life I had built wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't proof that Clara had been wrong about me. It was simply mine. For the first time, I wasn't trying to become successful so someone would regret losing me. I was successful because I had finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell me I was worth choosing. 2 years after the crash, I received a letter from Clara. Not a message, not a phone call, a handwritten letter. There was no accusation in it, no request, just 6 pages describing the woman she had been before the accident. She wrote that hearing people's hidden thoughts had made her realize how often she had ignored what they actually said. She had heard fear from employees who smiled at her. She had heard resentment from partners who praised her. She had even heard her mother's disappointment when Clara chose work over family. But the hardest thoughts to hear had always been mine. Not because I hated her, because I had loved her while quietly becoming unhappy. She wrote, I spent years believing that if you loved someone enough, you could make every decision for them and call it protection. I finally understand how wrong I was. I folded the letter and put it away. I didn't reply, not because I was cruel, because there was nothing left to explain. Our divorce was finalized 6 months later. It was peaceful. No screaming. No public accusations. No attempt to ruin each other's lives. We divided our belongings. She kept the old wedding photographs. I kept the notebook containing my original invention. For some reason, that felt right. A month later, my company secured a major contract to install our monitoring systems on hundreds of aging bridges. The project was worth more money than I had ever imagined earning. The news spread quickly. Journalists wanted interviews. Universities wanted speaking engagements. Investors wanted meetings. And suddenly, people who had ignored me began remembering my name. I didn't resent them. I had once wanted recognition desperately. Now I understood that recognition was only useful when it supported the life you actually wanted. One afternoon, I received an invitation from a university to speak to engineering students. I accepted. After the lecture, a young student approached me. Sir, can I ask you something? Of course. How did you keep going when everyone around you thought your idea had failed? I thought about Clara, about Marcus, about the hospital, about the accident. Then I answered honestly. I didn't keep going because I was strong. The student listened. I kept going because I eventually got tired of abandoning myself. He nodded slowly. That sentence stayed with me. So did the next chapter of my life. Nora and I became closer. It happened gradually. There was no dramatic confession. No perfect moment. One night, after working late, we were walking through the laboratory. She stopped beside the old prototype. You know, she said, when I met you, I thought you were impossible. That's romantic. I wasn't finished. She smiled. You were carrying so much guilt that you barely knew how to breathe. I looked at her. And now you're annoying for completely different reasons. I laughed. Then she reached for my hand. I held it. No promises were made that night. We didn't need them. 6 months later, we moved into a small house outside the city. It wasn't luxurious. There were boxes everywhere. The kitchen cabinets were uneven. The backyard needed work. But one evening, we sat on the porch eating takeout from paper containers, and I realized I had never felt more at peace. Nora leaned against my shoulder. What are you thinking? I smiled. Nothing. She laughed. That's a lie. I looked at her. I'm thinking that this feels like home. She squeezed my hand. Good. My life had become quiet in ways I once thought were impossible. My company continued to grow. We funded scholarships for young engineers who couldn't afford university. We donated monitoring equipment to communities that couldn't pay for it. I also started speaking publicly about intellectual property rights. Not because I wanted to expose my old company, but because I knew there were other people like the younger version of me. Talented, trusting, afraid of conflict. People who could lose years of work simply because they believed someone else knew better. One afternoon, after a conference, I saw Clara again. She was speaking on a panel about legal protection for independent inventors. She had changed. Her hair was shorter. Her voice was steadier. She wasn't the woman who had walked into that hospital room years earlier. And I wasn't the man sitting beside her bed. After the event, she approached me. Nora is waiting? Yes. Clara smiled. She's good for you. She is. I can tell. There was no bitterness in her voice. Then she said, I heard something about your scholarship program. What about it? I want to contribute. I looked at her. You don't have to. I know. She paused. I want to. I accepted. Not because I needed anything from her. Because sometimes healing meant allowing people to become better without requiring them to suffer forever. We shook hands. Then Clara turned to leave. I thought that would be the end. But she stopped. Daniel? Yes. I used to think the crash gave me a strange ability. She smiled faintly. Now I think it took something away. What? My excuses. I smiled. That sounds painful. It was... She looked at me one last time. But it was necessary. Then she walked away. Nora joined me a moment later. She looked toward Clara. Are you okay? I nodded. I'm okay. And I meant it. That night, I opened the old notebook. The pages were worn. The handwriting was mine, but it belonged to a younger man. A man who believed love meant sacrifice. A man who thought patience meant silence. A man who thought staying was always more honorable than leaving. I touched the first page. Then I closed the notebook. I didn't throw it away. I didn't burn it. I kept it because I no longer needed to hate the person I had been. He had done the best he could with what he understood. And when he finally understood more, he changed. That was enough. Still, there was one final thing I had never done. I had never returned to the place where the crash happened. Until that weekend. Nora came with me. We stood beside the road in silence. The trees had grown. The guardrail had been repaired. There was almost no sign that anything had happened there. I looked at the road and remembered Clara waking in the hospital. If she dies, I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself. That thought had terrified me. But now I understood something. The crash hadn't destroyed my marriage. The secrets had. The crash had simply made those secrets impossible to hide. And perhaps that was the strangest gift it had given us. The truth. 3 years after the crash, I received an invitation I almost ignored. It was from the same hospital where Clara had first opened her eyes and heard my thoughts. The hospital was launching a new rehabilitation program for patients with neurological injuries. They wanted me to speak about resilience. I almost declined. Then I saw the name of the doctor who had treated Clara. Dr. Evans. I accepted. On the morning of the event, Nora came with me. We walked through the same corridor where I had once spent 11 sleepless hours waiting for Clara to wake up. Everything looked smaller now. The chairs, the hallway, even the room where she had opened her eyes. I stood outside the door for a moment. Nora touched my shoulder. "You don't have to go in." "I know." I opened the door anyway. The room was empty. I remember Clara looking at me and saying, "You think it's your fault?" Back then, I thought that moment was the beginning of the end. Now I understood it had been the beginning of the truth. After my speech, Dr. Evans approached me. "There's something I wanted to tell you." "What?" "Clara contacted me recently." I looked at him. "Is she okay?" "She is." He smiled. "She wanted to know whether her condition could have been psychologically significant." "What did you tell her?" "That the accident didn't create honesty. It simply removed the barriers she had relied on." I nodded. That sounded like Clara. Before I left, Dr. Evans gave me a small envelope. "She asked me to give this to you if I ever saw you." I opened it outside. Inside was one page. "Daniel, I used to think the hardest part of hearing your thoughts was discovering that you were unhappy. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how long you had been unhappy while still choosing me. You could have left earlier. You didn't. You stayed because you loved me. I spent years thinking that proved I was worth staying for. Now I understand it proved what kind of person you were. I hope the life you built is everything I failed to help you build. And I hope you never again confuse loyalty with losing yourself." There was no request to meet. No apology at the end. Just her name. I folded the letter. Nora waited beside the car. "What did she say?" I handed it to her. She read it and returned it. "Are you going to answer?" I thought for a moment. Yes. That evening, I wrote Clara a letter. It was short. "Clara, thank you for telling me the truth. I don't regret loving you. I don't regret the years we shared. And I don't regret leaving when I realized I had disappeared inside the marriage. I hope you find peace." "I have. Daniel." I mailed it the next morning. Then I went to work. Because that was the beautiful thing about my life now. There was always a tomorrow. 5 years after the crash, my company completed its largest project. We had developed a monitoring network capable of detecting structural problems across entire transportation systems. The technology that had once been stolen from me had become the foundation for something far larger. At the launch ceremony, Nora stood beside me. Our daughter, Lily, was sitting in the front row with her grandmother. Yes, a daughter. 3 years after we married, Nora and I became parents. When Lily was born, I cried harder than I had cried during my divorce. Not because I was afraid, because I finally understood what it meant to build a family without fear. That night, after the ceremony, Lily fell asleep in my arms. Nora looked at me. "You're thinking again?" I smiled. "Always." "What now?" I looked at my daughter. "I was thinking about how strange life is." Nora leaned against me. "You sound serious." I was once sitting beside a hospital bed, convinced my life was ending. And now, I kissed Lily's forehead. Now I think it was beginning. Nora smiled. Years later, Clara and I occasionally crossed paths at professional events. We were never friends in the old sense. We didn't pretend nothing had happened. We didn't recreate the past, but we could speak. She eventually built a respected legal practice helping independent inventors. She became known for protecting people whose work was vulnerable to exploitation. Once, she introduced a young engineer to me. "This is Daniel," she told him. "He taught me something important." I raised an eyebrow. She smiled. "That sometimes the person you're trying to protect is the person you should have trusted." The young engineer looked confused. I laughed. "She's exaggerating." Clara shook her head. "No, I'm finally telling the truth." We both smiled. Then we said goodbye. No tears, no longing, no unfinished business. Just two people acknowledging that they had once loved each other and had eventually learned how to stop hurting each other. Years after that, I found the old wedding ring in a box. I held it for a long time. It represented something beautiful. It also represented something I had misunderstood. Marriage wasn't supposed to mean one person disappearing so the other could shine. Love wasn't supposed to require silence. Loyalty wasn't supposed to mean accepting betrayal. And forgiveness wasn't supposed to mean reopening a door that had already closed. I put the ring back in a box. Then I went outside. Lily was running through the garden. Nora was laughing. The sun was setting behind our house. I stood there watching them. For years, I thought the greatest revenge would be proving Clara wrong. It wasn't. The greatest victory was waking up one morning and realizing I no longer cared whether she regretted losing me. She had her life. I had mine. And mine was no longer built around being chosen. I had chosen myself. I had chosen my work. I had chosen honesty. I had chosen a woman who never needed to hear my thoughts to understand me. And I had chosen a family where love didn't have to be earned through sacrifice. Sometimes I still think about the crash. Sometimes I remember the sound of shattered glass. Sometimes I remember Clara opening her eyes. And sometimes I remember the first thought she ever heard from me. If she dies, I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself. I understand that man now. He wasn't weak. He wasn't foolish. He simply loved someone so deeply that he forgot he was supposed to love himself too. The crash didn't give Clara the ability to hear every hidden thought forever. Eventually, it faded. But by then, she didn't need it. Neither did I, because the truth had already been spoken, and the life that came after was better than either of us could have imagined. I didn't destroy the people who hurt me. I didn't become cruel. I didn't spend my life proving them wrong. I simply walked away from the place where I had stopped recognizing myself. Then I built something new, something honest, something peaceful, something that didn't need anyone else's approval. And that became the final lesson of my life. You can forgive someone without returning to them. You can remember love without living in the past. And sometimes the person you think you're losing is actually the person you're finally becoming.